So the talk this evening is about mindfulness and following up on right mindfulness that we talked about last time, and a little bit about how the Zen tradition fits in with all of this. So, and the other thing that I will touch on is a bit more about the four foundations of mindfulness as introduced by Thich Nhat Hanh. That's found in the Pali Canon. So here we go, mindfulness. So I have three thoughts as I approach the talk for this evening. One aspiration or hope that I have is that this will support you in an investigation and carrying the question for yourselves: what is mindfulness? What is mindfulness as you practice it? What is it in your life? I feel like I introduce a lot of talks these days saying that we are living through such unusual and historic times and challenging times in the midst of a pandemic and an incredible political situation. It feels good to think about mindfulness and to orient ourselves to our deepest aspirations in practice as we meet how this is all unfolding. So mindfulness as a foundation, precepts in mindfulness as a foundation seem good. So my other second thought or hope as I approach this talk is, as I said before, giving a very, very general overview of the four foundations of mindfulness from the Satipatthana Sutta. And this is an interesting thing for me to talk about. It's going to be a very general overview. My practice relationship with the four foundations of mindfulness comes through sort of this Zen filter. I've worked with it in the context of Zen retreats, so not traditionally, and I have not taken a deep dive into it. So I just want to give a full disclosure there. But there is a way that it fits in with our lineage tradition and our practice. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about these points of orientation. So again, it's an overview and not a scholarly approach at all to the sutra, but hopefully will inspire you if you are interested to look at that further. And the third thing that I've already kind of mentioned is as a point or aspiration of the talk is just to give a little bit of context about how Zen and our lineage tradition express orient towards these practices. The language that we find in Heart of the Buddha's Teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh is a little bit, some of it is a little bit different than the language that we will use in our tradition. They point us all to the same thing. It's actually really helpful to have different ways, different language we're talking about. It kind of fleshes out our own understanding. But I want to offer a couple of points to kind of keep us oriented and maybe shed some light on how, what the differences are and clarify. So that's where we're headed. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is this last thing I mentioned, is a couple of points of orientation that I think might be helpful. So the last chapter that we read in Thich Nhat Hanh's book was right mindfulness. So I wanted to mention, and just kind of keeping us oriented where we're at. So we're in the section of the book where he's talking about the Noble Eightfold Path. So the eightfold, and so I'm kind of, I imagine myself kind of backing into or expanding out into putting this in this larger context. So the Eightfold Path is the last of the Four Noble Truths, the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths are foundational teaching in all of Buddhism, which I believe everybody's familiar with these teachings, of the truth of the first noble truth being the truth of dukkha, of what's translated as suffering or dissatisfaction. The second one being that there is a cause for dukkha, usually expressed as the three poisons: greed, hate, and delusion. The third noble truth being that there can be an end to suffering, and the fourth being the truth of path as that way to find that end to suffering and liberation, freedom. So in the way that the Four Noble Truths are expressed, that fourth noble truth is the truth of path, traditionally expressed as the Noble Eightfold Path. In our tradition, we often express the truth of path in terms of the bodhisattva ideal, or the 16 bodhisattva practice precepts. So I just wanted to put that in there, because sometimes there's this question about, well, there's the Eightfold Path, but when do we talk about that in Zen? And so, and there's a way that they line up. There's a way that they express the path just in different ways and different emphasis. So I wanted to put that in there. And the second bit of orientation is, I think it's helpful to know about or recall that, so where we are in our lineage tradition, we're part of the Zen path, part of the Mahayana division. So there's two major schools, two major divisions, the Theravadan path and the Mahayana. And so we're part of the Mahayana, and we often, as I've already touched on, we express hesitate to use the word goal, but the path of practice as being that of the Bodhisattva and the Bodhisattva ideal. And often, and this is where I am not at all an expert, but in the Theravadan path, it's more expressed as that of becoming an arhat, or one who has attained liberation, freedom from suffering. So offer that as a way of just giving some clarity about how that language is used, how that is expressed. The way I think of those two major schools, two major ways of orienting to practice and path, is like they all bring us to the same essential truth, the same orient us the same way, just different expressions and emphasis and flavors of getting there, different medicines for each of us, just ways to find our way and what supports us and works for us. All right, so those were the couple of things that I wanted to offer in terms of orientation. And we're talking about the Eightfold Path, which is part of the Four Noble Truths. And this is kind of our way of, that's one way of expressing that fourth noble truth, the truth of path. And we do it through precept. So switching gears a little bit to talking, now getting into mindfulness and right mindfulness. So mindfulness and mindfulness practices are showing up all kinds of places in popular culture these days. And we touched a little bit about that in our discussion last week about how it's potentially being co-opted in some ways. And there's some interesting things about that. So I wanted to just offer a couple of general common definitions of mindfulness, and then talk about right mindfulness and how that is used in a really specific way in Buddhism. So mindfulness is, here's one definition that I like from Rick Hanson, the author of The Buddhist Brain, a teacher and neuroscientist. He says, mindfulness is simply a continuous, non-judgmental, accepting awareness of your inner and outer world, especially your inner one, the flow of experience. There's a very grounded awareness, not some kind of lofty mystical state. So continuous, non-judgmental, accepting awareness of your inner and outer world. And then another definition it offers from Jon Kabat-Zinn, the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a program that's been going over 30 years, kind of one of the gurus of mindfulness. He defines it as this: mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And then he sometimes adds, in service of self-understanding and wisdom. So mindfulness is awareness that arises, through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And it's interesting that he doesn't always add that piece about in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. So in that first definition given by Rick Hanson, it speaks to a particular way of paying attention. And then that second definition by Jon Kabat-Zinn mentions this way of paying attention that contributes to orienting and cultivating and touching base with our own inner wisdom. So shifting now to right mindfulness, this is different in that it's different than this broad definition of non-judgmental awareness, and that has a pretty specific meaning in the context of Buddhism. And we talked about that last week, but I wanted to kind of loop back to it again. So when you look up the specific definition of like what is right mindfulness in the Eightfold Path, it is defined as specifically defined as awareness of body, feeling, thinking, mind, and objects of mind. So let me sure if I got that right. Yeah, awareness of body, feeling, thinking or mind, and then the last one being objects of mind. So one thing that doesn't quite, so this is, the word in Sanskrit is, I'm going to mispronounce it, smriti, S-M-R-I-T-I, and the Pali word is sati. And those are translated as mindfulness, but they don't quite capture this one element in there, which is smriti means remember or recollection. So it has this element, this other added nuance to it. Alan Senaki in a book called What's Wrong with Mindfulness, which is a great book, says this about what that definition is of right mindfulness. He says, one remembers oneself and one's intention moment by moment. One takes the scattered pieces of actions or awareness and recollects them in wholeness. I'm going to read that one more time. One remembers oneself and one's intention moment by moment. One takes the scattered pieces of actions or awareness and recollects them in wholeness. So it's remembering your intention, aligning with your intention moment by moment. And then here's a passage from the chapter that we read last week from Thich Nhat Hanh, what he says about right mindfulness. So, right mindfulness is the heart of the Buddhist teaching. Traditionally, right mindfulness is the seventh on the path of the 8 right practices, but it is presented here third to emphasize its great importance. When right mindfulness is present, the Four Noble Truths, And 7 other elements of the Eightfold Path are also present. When we are mindful, our thinking is right thinking, or our speech is right speech, and so on. Right mindfulness is the energy that brings us back to the present moment. To cultivate mindfulness in ourselves is to cultivate the Buddha within. So that orients us to how right mindfulness takes us to this deeper understanding of self and cultivating of wisdom. Now I'm going to turn to an overview of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. I mentioned above, those include mindfulness of body, mindfulness of feelings or sensations, mindfulness of mind or mental states, and mindfulness of mental objects. So again, I'm going to provide an overview here, but my practice relationship is having been introduced to these practices in the context of actually Zen retreats and being guided through awareness of body, awareness of feeling and feeling tone, and awareness of thought and formations around thought. So I'm going to provide just a bit of an overview, and this will be the last thing that I talk about, and then we'll just kind of open it up for discussion. So, and I'm going to put the book that I referred to, and also a couple of links to Domyo Burke's podcast on the 4 foundation of mindfulness, because I drew on her summary in preparation for this, and it's a great talk. She actually has 2 talks on that. So I'll put those in the chat when I'm done if you want to listen to those or refer to those. So here's just a paragraph or 2 of her summary about this intention of the 4 foundations of mindfulness that she offers. So here, first she describes like what are the overall intention and purpose of the Buddha offering this guidance about how to explore. She says, whenever the Buddha wanted to explain how to attain liberation, he gave a teaching on the 4 foundations of mindfulness, sometimes translated as establishings. She goes on to say, certainly the Buddha also mentioned you should pay attention to your circumstances, ideally not be too wrapped up in the drama of the world, and behave morally. But once you had those basic prerequisites taken care of, you should practice mindfulness. Here the Buddha's own word, here's the Buddha's own words on the practice of mindfulness from the sutta, the Satipatthana Sutra itself. So here's a little bit from that. He said, this is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of pain and distress, for the attainment of the right method, and for the realization of unbinding, or nirvana. In other words, the 4 establishings of mindfulness. Which 4? There is the case where a monk remains focused on the body in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, subduing greed and distress with reference to the world, remains focused on feelings, mind, mental qualities, in and of themselves, ardent, alert, and mindful, subduing greed and distress with reference to the world. I wanted to read just a little bit of that directly from the sutra, just to give you a flavor of the sound and the rhythm of the language, and that was sort of the overview of the purpose of these teachings. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the 4. So the first one is the first foundation of mindfulness is mindfulness of the body. Mindfulness, it said mindfulness of the body in the body. So when we read the chapter last week, Thich Nhat Hanh summarized several of the practices that could be engaged and that are described in that sutra. Overall, is practicing the whole body and mind experience of breathing without conceptualizing out, without words. So easier said than done. my experience with this is using breath as an anchoring practice, as a way of settling. So that's one kind of relationship with that. Yeah, I have a little bit more here about all the different ways that he talks about investigating body and the breath, but I'm going to move on to talk about, I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I'm going to talk about mindfulness of feelings. So the second one is about feelings, and feelings here are traditionally put into just three simple categories: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So Thich Nhat Hanh described it this way in his chapter. When we have a pleasant feeling, we may have a tendency to cling to it. And when we have an unpleasant feeling, we may be inclined to chase it away. But it's more effective in both cases to return to our breathing and simply observe the feeling, identifying it silently. Breathing, I know a pleasant or unpleasant feeling is in me. Breathing out, I know there is a pleasant or unpleasant feeling in me. Calling a feeling by its name, such as joy, happiness, anger, or sorrow, helps us identify and see it deeply. So just simply noticing feelings as they arise and fall, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, without anything extra. The practice in guided meditation can first be done by just checking in with the feeling tone, just noticing what is present. And then also practicing with the arising of feeling coming into existence, having a duration, and then falling away, extinguishing. And being present with this without analysis or judgment or anything extra at all. So I'm going to talk about mindfulness of mind and then mindfulness of dharma or mental qualities. And these kind of go together, overlap. These are the ones that are talked about in different ways and translated in different ways. So this is awareness of mind, mindfulness of the mind in the mind. So interesting. So when Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this in this chapter, he talks at length about mental formations. So being aware of mind is to become aware of mental formations. And mental formations gets into some pretty specific terminology and meaning in Buddhism, and I'll share that a little bit here because it can be helpful. Formations so formations, the definitions I haven't realized they kind of fold into themselves, but they because they start to just refer to each other. But one definition is all your concepts and thoughts, from the most mundane to the most grandiose. Another definition is the activity of forming and the passive state of being formed. And it kind of combines with what I'm going to talk about next, which is about thoughts. So I'm going to also go to that. Seems like I had a little bit more I wanted to say about this. Let me make sure here. So it kind of goes with mindfulness of awareness of thought and our objects of thought. So I'm going to go down to the fourth one, which is mindfulness of dharma or mental qualities. So this again is translated in a few different ways. And it's helpful to know that this word dharma or dhamma, we usually say dharma with a big D refers to the teachings, like literally translated, I believe, as the law or the natural law. So that's the Buddha's teaching, the teaching of the truth. Little d, dharma, refers to phenomena. So everything that exists are dharmas, everything that arises. One description or translation of this fourth foundation of mindfulness from Ajahn Thanissaro, a pretty well-known Thai forest monk. He says it this way. He translated as mental qualities. And this is because the list of subjects to be mindful of included in this fourth type of practice point us to working with our own internal experience, mental qualities, whatever's arising and how we're, so it's the thoughts that are arising and the objects of those thoughts. And Thich Nhat Hanh translates it, as we know from last week, mindfulness of phenomena. And he says mindfulness he makes the point that what arises in the mind as a thought has an object. So when we're angry at something. That was kind of part of his point. So there's a long list in the sutras of all the ways that you could practice with mindfulness of dharmas, and it gets into a lot of detail. And we touched on this last week, but some of the examples are mindfulness of the five hindrances, mindfulness of the ephemeral and the falling apart of the skandhas, which makes us up. And mindfulness in particular of the Four Noble Truths as an object that can be engaged through this mindfulness of mental qualities. Seeing what causes suffering to arise, how it can end in the path of practice. So another whole different expression of this last foundation of mindfulness is, and the way that we would think about it in the Mahayana, is an investigation of emptiness, of the unconditioned, of shunyata. So from a teacher named Barbara O'Brien, she writes this about both about little d dharmas. It's helpful to know, and about what this turns us to. So she says it's important to understand that the phenomenal world is not something that is out there, separate from us. The Buddha taught that everything inter-exists. All phenomena, including us, are conditioned and defined by all other phenomena. This is because of that. Individual things, from teapots to toasters to living beings, are experienced as mental objects. We know them as we know them because of how our brain senses respond to stimuli, also because we've been taught from birth to recognize things in a particular way. This is the very interdependent relationship of the mind and the phenomenal world. She goes on to say, one last little paragraph here. Very basically, mindfulness of dharmas is pure awareness of whatever there is. There's a bird song, there's a bird song. It's not you listening to the bird song, or is the bird song coming from out there somewhere? The experience of birdsong is right here. So this fourth foundation of being mindfulness of dharmas, of phenomena and our response to them, we can investigate them, this awareness of phenomenon, through all these various teachings and practices that were part of the list that I just read. But ultimately, this investigation is about our own inner experience and turns us towards understanding the nature of things and the interconnectedness of things, how all things arise together, as she was describing. They arise and come into existence because of everything else. They inter-are, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say. One last couple of thoughts. Wait, went long, I apologize. This again from Barbara O'Brien. She says, in Mahayana Buddhism, the fourth foundation of mindfulness is awareness of shunyata, or emptiness, which is also the basis of wisdom. This much misunderstood doctrine teaches us that all phenomena are empty of self-essence, as well as inter-existing. This distinction we see between this and that is something we are projecting. It is not intrinsic to the things and beings around us. So in a sense, a particular phenomena exists as a mental object, not as a thing in itself. So it's our experience of it. So we end here with this exploration of wisdom, emptiness, that mindfulness leads us to. Right? Mindfulness, the four foundation of mindfulness, all of these different teachings and practices point us towards our own wisdom, our understanding how things are, and understanding that we are part of that wisdom, manifestations of that wisdom. So there's a lot more that I realized as I prepared, that I bit off a very large topic, and there's a lot more to say about it. And I may have just completely muddied the water by everything that I just have introduced, but I'm hoping maybe it just whets your appetite for this. We talk about the skandhas and work with the skandhas, like in our foundational teachings class. It kind of shows up there. There's different ways that it shows up. But I will end right there and open it up to comments or discussion. So thank you. Feel free to unmute.
Shintai, how has this working with these foundations of mindfulness impacted you?
I have found them useful in offering some spaciousness, right? So when this is how, and I didn't quite get this into my talk, but when we do foundational teachings about the skandhas, about like all the things that make up in the Buddhist teachings, what makes up a person, like form, feelings, perceptions, consciousness, having some spaciousness and not over-identifying with any one of these, I think has really, that's really a lot of practice of not over-identifying with any of these. I'd be curious to know if you have any relationship to it, Joshin, or any thoughts about that yourself. You don't have to have any, I'm just curious.
I always have thoughts. But really, I'd like to invite questions or comments from
and other people's experience with these mindfulness practices, or if there's things that seem unclear that would be good to talk about another time, we can put it on the list. Because there's a lot in there. That's why I kind of like tried to loop back to the chapter that we did, because there was so much.
This may be off topic, but what about when mindfulness just makes things worse? When noticing exaggerates the things.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you mentioned that, because sometimes it can seem like there's a rigidity to the practice or an insistence, and sometimes it's not the right medicine to focus our attention directly on it. Sometimes it really truly is not. So there's wisdom in recognizing that it's not always the thing to be doing, and that's okay. And that's also attending to your own inner wisdom about how you find your way. Like the path unfolds so many different ways for people. And I know from my own experience, there's times when sitting zazen can send me down, like just down a well of depression. Like it just is not the right medicine. So doing other practices, being outdoors, doing sound meditation, movement, all those much more grounded and healthy at that time. So I'm glad I brought that up. Does that answer? Do you have anything about your own experience? Happy to hear that too.
So Dixie's question resonates with me because very often my experience has been that becoming mindful of my various habit energies is not always a fun experience. It can be, wasn't it, I think Shinryu Suzuki who said meditation is one embarrassment after another.
Or one mistake, one continuous mistake.
One continual mistake, and becoming aware of and that might not be what you meant, Dixie, but that's what it woke up in me is remembering how it felt at first to open this horrible can of worms. And I was like, well, that's not very much fun. It wasn't coming. But I think that sometimes things get worse before they get better. And I think it's sometimes good to stick with it with the support of a teacher.
So it looked like Jeshurun was going to say something. I was also going to, I'll just put in there, just pacing yourself is extremely important. Knowing we expand our awareness of habit energy, and sometimes it really is very, very difficult to face without some kind of support of Sangha and community and teachers, and not just throw that gate wide open with no support. And just knowing yourself, pacing yourself. Yoshin?
Both Keiko and you just hit on that point of having the support of others, especially when working with mindfulness or beginning to work with mindfulness and becoming aware of thoughts and mental formations, habits of mind, patterns of mind. Like such a huge part of this practice is not only self-discovery, but becoming intimate with our own minds and accepting of our own minds and patterns. Oftentimes when we first start looking at what arises in the mind, we see so much that we have tried to suppress or reject over the years. And when we see it, it can be unsettling, disturbing. I don't want that. That's not me. That's not who I am. And it's with the support of a Sangha and with the support of a teacher that can help not only provide a context for this practice, but also a gentle witness for you and your practice as it arises and develops. And then over time, as that intimacy and familiarity with the content of your own mind increases, that capacity to hold whatever arises in mind also increases. So that internal mental self-resiliency also increases. Does that make sense or address that particular question? I am very much aware of starting practice and just going, what is all of this stuff in my head?
I like that too. I like that too. I find it very useful. I was specifically thinking of pain or itching, especially being really difficult when you become mindful of them. But what you said is also equally important to me.
Thank you.
I think it's important to remember that there are three pieces to mindfulness. This is as Thich Nhat Hanh teaches it, I think. And one is our ethical conduct. Two is concentration or meditation. And three is insight or wisdom. But the important part is that without ethical conduct, the other two aren't possible. It's a vital part of the whole path.
Thanks for saying that, Ed. I was trying to bring that out at the beginning of the talk. It's like the ethical, that mindfulness in this kind of secular movements can sometimes leave that out, that ethical part. So what our foundational primary teachings in Zen are precepts, ethical practice, and Zazen, meditation, and then making it function in the world. So, but thanks for highlighting that. That's like, yes, yes. It looks like we have maybe a minute left, maybe for any burning comments or thoughts from anyone that hasn't had a chance.
So, Shintai, something you just said really was, I mean, this is a great discussion, but I think you said sometimes Zen doesn't, all it does is just bring up a bigger mess in my brain that I can't get rid of. But then, like you said, maybe that's not the right practice for that moment, and going for a walk or being with nature is. And that's really helpful, because sometimes that's like, well, I should be meditating, but then I'm just getting my head in a big mess. And so I'm trying to tell my head, stop thinking, but it won't. But if I go for a walk, a lot of times it just like, I just feel much more comfortable and much more grounded. So that was really helpful. It's all very helpful, but that struck me. Thank you.
Thanks, Trish.
I was just going to say the same
sorry.
thing.
Go ahead.
My Zazen is better when on a walk, when I'm walking for an hour, than it is on the cushion.
And I just wanted to reinforce that by mentioning that the mindfulness of body in that sutta, it's every possible posture. It's not just sitting, it's, I think this is in the Metta Sutta that we chant as well. It's not like, so you're not practicing mindfulness if you're not sitting. We focus on that so much. But it's, turning and moving your head and moving your arm and walking and lying down. So if you need permission from a text, I guess it gives it. Sorry.
That's awesome.
Mindfulness of being an embodied being.
And as for cultivating all this and generating compassion that goes outward, then we also offer compassion inward. There's the person that is doing the practice and sitting and offering what's needed for this being. It's a place for that. All right, I think it's time. It's more than time. So I'll say the closing verse. Let's make our show. Abiding in this ephemeral world, like a lotus in muddy water, the mind is pure and goes beyond. Thus we bow to Buddha, all Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Maha Prajna Paramita. Well, thank you for your kind attention, everyone, and for being here. Really appreciate us coming together. So feel free to unmute yourselves.